Today we're celebrating 100 videos by taking a look at the kind of writing advice they were giving out 100 years ago. In 1906, the brothers H.W. and F.G. Fowler published a hefty little book called The King's English, which was a guide for writers to avoid the kinds of errors and blunders that the brothers thought were all too common in their day. But compared to other writing guides of the time, they decided to do something a little different. In the preface, they write, "The principle adopted here has been 1. To pass by all rules of whatever absolute importance that are shown by observation to be seldom or never broken, and 2. To illustrate by living examples, with the name of a reputable authority attached to each, all blunders that observation shows to be common." That is, they wanted to avoid the tiresome practice of listing out every possible error and focus only on the most common ones. And, the book is nearly 400 pages long, so I guess we can be thankful that they tried to keep it concise. They also wanted to give real-life examples, probably to show that danger was lurking behind every corner, because if even published authors could make these mistakes, then you, dear reader, were surely at risk of embarrassing yourself, and, of course, you wouldn't want to embarrass yourself, would you? At the risk of giving away the ending before we've even begun, the King's English is definitely a product of its time and place. Language and societies change, and what counts as right or wrong changes right along with them. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend this book as a good guide for writers today, but it is a fascinating look at what the rules were over 100 years ago, and it can give us some interesting perspectives on the rules that we get so worked up about now. So I think we should just get into it and take a look at some of the rules that the Fowlers thought were worth enforcing. Oh, but before we do, I do want to take just a quick moment to thank Jeff Stone for requesting a video on this topic, because it's been a lot of fun to put together. Now let's get to it. I guess I should get it out of the way first, but it ought to come as no surprise that a book entitled The King's English would dedicate at least some of its attention to complaining about American English. In fact, the phrase "I guess" is one of the Americanisms that the Fowlers object to, even as they acknowledge that Chaucer made frequent use of it. Of course, they say when a self-respecting Englishman uses it, he's learned it not from Chaucer, but from the Yankees, so it should be avoided at all costs. Other American offenders are words like transpire and antagonize and apparently waddle. And then there's also anyway and standpoint. And I don't know, our non-American friends will have to let us know whether these words are still as completely and irredeemably American as they're made out to be in this book, but I'd suspect that the lines aren't and never really were drawn as firmly as the Fowlers make it sound. What is undeniably amusing, though, is the way that they express their concern over the encroachment of Americanisms into the English language. They say, "The English and the American language and literature are both good things, but they are better apart than mixed." And then they comment, "Everyone knows an Americanism at present when he sees it. How long that will be true is a more anxious question." Clearly, of all the things to be anxious about, the rise of Americanisms is certainly one of them. And I suppose this channel is part of the problem, so I should probably apologize for antagonizing the two poor brothers. But the defenders of the King's English don't just object to Americanisms. Foreign words of any origin also find themselves at the receiving end of the Fowlers' disdain. Really outlandish ones like status quo, regime, and camaraderie. Oh, and let's not forget the complaint that the Latin phrase alma mater should never be used in place of the more familiar word university. But last I checked, university is also a word of thoroughly Latin origin, so I guess I'm not too sure why that one's okay. Now, I will admit that they do make a good point. There's a lot of pretentiousness that goes into using foreign words. And excuse my French, but if I ever hear another academic use the word oeuvre to describe an author's body of work, I'll probably lose it in a fairly modest way. Showing off is always in poor taste, though, and foreign words are often used to show off. So when we see pages and pages of rules about avoiding foreign words, I do kind of worry that we might miss the point. It's not about reducing our vocabularies to the smallest number of Anglo-Saxon words possible. It's about not showing off. But the larger point for us is that the people who make up rules and put them in books are usually not all that concerned with what's right and wrong. In fact, the Fowlers don't call Americanisms wrong. They're totally fine for Americans. They're just not English. And if you're trying to preserve a particular national or cultural identity through language, letting words in from other parts of the world can be a real problem. So, to take a page out of Richard Lanham's book, Rules like these often are much less about the words and phrases themselves and much more about the people who use those words and phrases. In that light, these rules might start to look a little bit more like the political and social commentary that they are, rather than objective laws of truth and reason. Rulemakers aren't usually just concerned with maintaining the national or cultural exclusivity of their language. They're often also working to resist changes over time. In the preface to the third edition, H.W. Fowler wrote, "It has sometimes seemed to us that some of the conspicuous solecisms once familiar no longer met our eyes daily in the newspapers. Could it be that we had contributed to their rarity? Or was the rarity imaginary? I do not know, but a glimmer of hope has made the present revision an agreeable task." So a book like this one is meant to put the brakes on language change and to keep things as they are, sometimes in response to corruption by groups as distasteful as the youths. Of course, the Fowlers don't indulge in much kids these days talk, but it is interesting to see how they're working to respond to natural linguistic changes. For example, they spend a good long time complaining about the phrase mutual friends on the basis that mutual can only refer to reciprocal relationships. So, they argue, two people can technically be mutual friends with each other, but a friend that they have in common cannot possibly be their mutual friend. Obviously, some of our largest social networks have missed that memo, but it's also true that the brothers Fowler seem to have missed the memo that mutual friend shows up in English at least as far back as 1630. So their insistence that mutual friend is bad English ignores the fact that the phrase existed in normal English for almost 300 years before they decided to complain about it. And of course, they spend some time encouraging readers never to use they as a singular pronoun, always plural, and even more, of course, they suggest that he is the most appropriate replacement. Now, I trust we don't need to go into all of the reasons that the Fowlers lost that fight, but they undeniably have. Singular they predated their book by more than a century, and it's going as strong as ever a century later. But the Fowlers' commentary on language isn't all overly careful nonsense. In fact, some of it gives interesting insights into the ways that the language was changing in the early 1900s. For example, in talking about living and dead metaphors, they say that shattered authority, dwelling on an injury, pursuing a policy, and throwing light on a situation are all still living metaphors. But I'd wager that by now, they're pretty much dead. So, because the Fowlers were writing their commentaries in the early 1900s, we get a chance to see that phrases that have basically become dead metaphors to us still held on to some of their picturesque effect 100 years ago. Also, in their commentary on punctuation, they point out that the colon is dying out for two primary reasons. First, the decay of formal periodic arrangement, and second, the encroachment of the dash as a savor of trouble and an exponent of emotion. And interestingly, though the colon hasn't died out today, periodic arrangement pretty much has, and the dash has asserted itself as a flexible and emotionally expressive punctuation mark. Even if old rulebooks aren't all that useful for writers today, they can still be really cool if you're interested in the history of language. It's kind of like taking a core sample from a glacier or something. You get to see what the language was like back then and what people were worried about at the time. As I read through the King's English, I found some other tidbits that piqued my interest, and now none of these will be on the final, because how could there be a final, but they're fun nonetheless. For example, the Fowler brothers demonstrate their unparalleled wisdom and excellence when they say that hyphens are regrettable necessities and to be done without when they reasonably may. If you've been watching this show for a while, then you know that we're currently working through a series about punctuation, and we haven't gotten to hyphens yet, but the Fowlers are spot on with this one. Hyphens are ridiculous, and you should avoid them because they're ugly, they're silly, and they smell bad. But even when they do make some very good and valid points, the Fowlers also make some strange and unhelpful decrees. Did you know, despite the fact that vividity is a non-standard variation of the word vividness, the Fowlers don't object to it because it's an unnecessary replacement for a more common word. They object on the grounds of its fourfold repetition of the same vowel sound and two dentals that add to the ugliness of its two V's. First of all, what? I'm sure you weren't expecting today to learn that V's are ugly and that adding T's and D's to them only makes it worse. I sure wasn't. Now, I'm all for making rules against ugliness, but since when is V ugly? And speaking of their bad takes on the sounds of language, these esteemed guardians of Royal English go right for my heart by calling alliteration a novice's toy that only shows up in serious writing by negligence. It's horrendous humbug, blazing balderdash, malignant malarkey, utterly disdainful doggerel. Alliteration is a pure and simple delight, a gift from language to us. It's almost as if the Fowlers are anti-fun. And clearly, this show is pro-fun. But anyway, oops, there's one of those pesky Americanisms again. I should say, at any rate, there was one more thing that I thought was fairly interesting. Towards the end of the book, the brothers make the fairly reasonable point that writers should choose their words more carefully in order to use fewer of them. So, instead of saying somewhat terrifying, a writer should say creepy or unsettling. Rather than picking a really intense word and lessening it with an adjective, they argue that you should just pick a less intense word to begin with. And that's fair enough, but in some of the examples that they present, it looks like they may have missed a pretty interesting pattern in the language. We see, for example, these sentences. Thirdly, it is rather agonizing at times to the philologist, and the songs are sung by students to the accompaniment of a somewhat agonizing band. Fowler and Fowler would say that these writers should have used a mellower word than agonizing, but I sense that something else besides bad writing may be at work here. Admittedly, it would be pretty unusual and unnecessary to qualify an intense adjective when less intense words are available, but language users are pretty good about using the tools available to them. If they're doing something new, there's likely a reason for it, and that reason is probably to convey a meaning that doesn't already exist in the language. Of course, these two data points are not solid grounds for a more generalizable claim, but I can see these writers using somewhat agonizing as a way of creating a sort of spectrum or scale of agonizing experiences. That is, of course, torture or starvation are actually agonizing, and it would be unfair to say that listening to a band is agonizing in the same way. But as far as listening to bands does go, there are good bands and ones that are, relatively speaking, agonizing. So maybe, by crafting the phrase somewhat agonizing, the second writer wants to assert that the band is as bad as bands get, while also acknowledging that the agony of listening to that band isn't on the same level as actual torture. Thus, the phrase somewhat agonizing is born. So on the one hand, we may just have an example of lazy writing, or on the other, we may have an example of innovative language users expressing a shade of meaning that they couldn't before. And I won't say too authoritatively what we're seeing here, but I will point out that the Fowlers regularly seem to insist that words can only mean and do one thing, and they often complain about words being used in new or innovative ways. But the reality is that words can do whatever we want them to do. As long as people understand us, our words are doing their job. And it's not just the Fowlers. We have way too many people today who insist that words can only mean one thing, and that they have some kind of integrity beyond the ways that we use them. The truth, though, is that language is pretty slippery and that words wiggle all over the place. So we could try to pin it down and hold it in place, or we could embrace that slipperiness and start doing really cool things with words that nobody else has ever done before. Well, I suppose that's about all I have to say about the King's English. It may not be the most relevant guide for writers today, but it's still a lot of fun to look at. Really, when it comes to books like this, the title says it all. It's called The King's English, not a concise guide to logical and correct English. That second book could never exist, but the first one does. Rule books like this don't really tell us what's right or wrong, even if they claim to. Really, they just show us how a particular group of people chose to use their language at a particular point in time. So this book is a guide to the kind of English that the King of England must have spoken in the early 1900s. But England doesn't have a king anymore, and English just ain't what it used to be. And it's easy to poke fun at a book like this 100 years later, but the fact is that guides like these still exist even today. And I won't deny that they play an important social or cultural function, but that's exactly the point. The rules that they express are cultural, not cosmic. Usage guides like this seek to prescribe rules, usually in order to keep the linguistic habits of lower-class people out of publication, in order to reinforce the prestige of people like the king and those who speak like him. They also try to prevent or slow the rate of linguistic change, which frankly feels a little futile to me. So even today, the rules are products of their time and place. We can learn the rules and even practice them, but we ought to take them with a grain of salt and recognize them for the social inventions that they are. If you happen to break the rules and use a ridiculous American word like antagonize, you're not doing something fundamentally wrong, you're just choosing to ignore an established convention, and as long as you have a meaningful reason for it, I see no reason to object. Besides, you might just end up writing something that's a lot more readable and interesting than if you had kept all the rules. More than once, I found the examples of bad writing in this book a lot more lively and engaging than the author's painstakingly correct prose. But then again, if you, like the Fowlers, want to sound like a caricature of a 19th century butler, then by all means do it. Don't let me stop you. But I probably will stop myself, right here in fact. As always, thank you for watching. I suppose 100 videos was inevitable when I started, but I never really imagined it would actually happen. And yet here we are, and here's to 100 more. This one came about thanks to a suggestion from you, and I'm always eager to talk about the things that are interesting to you, so don't be shy about letting me know. Either way, it's always good to see you, and I'm excited to meet again soon for the 101st time.